morning, everyone. Anyone here know who John Denver is? John Denver. Wow, more than I thought. My parents love John Denver, and whenever we traveled as a family anywhere, it was always one of 3 8-track albums in our Pontiac station wagon. The Eagles, the Carpenters, or John Denver. And one of his songs is called Prodigal Son. Do some of you remember that song? Younger people, do you even know who or what I'm talking about? No. All right. Well, as a child, country singer, as a child, I was vaguely aware that John Denver got that title, Prodigal Son, from a story in the Bible. So even though I had no clue what the word prodigal meant, it really didn't bother me or faze me, didn't keep me from listening to the song, because my perception at that time was that the Bible was such an old and unfamiliar book that you really couldn't understand anything in it anyway. So as I grew in my faith, especially after meeting my wife, Micheline, I remember actually reading the Bible and being utterly fascinated. Maybe some of you are experiencing this too. Eventually I made it to the story of the prodigal son, and I actually got excited. And I thought, oh yeah, so this is the prodigal son story. And then briefly wondered again what the word prodigal meant. And after reading the story, I figured that the word prodigal must be some sort of wanderer or stray, because after all, the prodigal son in the story wanders off, didn't he? It wasn't until years later, in fact, that I actually began to understand the word prodigal. If you look up prodigal in the dictionary, the definition reads, recklessly wasteful, extravagant. So the story of the prodigal son is the story of a son who was recklessly wasteful. Having convinced his father to give him his inheritance early, he then squandered it all on fast living before finally coming home. But I'm realizing more and more, particularly as I mature in my faith, as God speaks to me and teaches me and stretches my mind, that actually what the story is really about, I don't think it's about the son. I think the story is actually about the father. And notice how it begins in Luke chapter 15, verse 11. There was a man who had 2 sons. Who's the subject of the sentence? It's the man. The sons are the object. The story, I believe, is about the father, the prodigal father. It's actually about a father who is extravagant, even reckless, dare I say, wasteful with his love for his children, I believe. And to fully appreciate it, I think we really need to see it and walk through it together in its entirety. If you'd like to follow along, you can open up your Bibles to Luke 15. We're starting in verse 11. If you want to use the Pew Bible, open up to page 849, the parable of the lost son. What's really cool is if you study this story carefully, this just blew my mind, it can tell you more about God than you've ever dreamed. In my mind, this is one of the most important stories in our Bibles, in the entire Bible, because it's a story of what the Heavenly Father is like. And I'm learning that more and more in my life. If you want to know how God feels about you, if you want to know how much you are worth in God's eyes, if you're even asking now or wondering, do I have any significance in this vast universe? This is the story for you. This story literally answers the question, how does God feel about me? The story is a parable from our Savior's heart, literally from the mouth of God. And we learned last week, it's the third story in a triumvirate of stories Jesus shares in response to discontented and outraged, muttering Pharisees. Who is this rabbi, they're asking? And what in God's name is he doing hanging out with this riffraff of Israel? I think we're learning that the Pharisees didn't think much of Jesus. A fellow rabbi was actually dragging down the reputation of other rabbis, of the church leaders. And even God himself, he's marring his reputation in their eyes by associating with the outcasts of society. And as we're learning, our Savior doesn't really put up with this muttering and whispering. It didn't sit well with him. So he turns to them and tells them about a shepherd who had 100 sheep and lost one, a woman who had 10 coins and lost one, and a father who had 2 sons and lost one. That's what we covered last week. Friends, for years I read the story of the prodigal son, thinking that the son was the center of the action. But my whole view of that story, and even of God, was elevated when I finally it occurred to me in a flash, in a glimpse, that the story is not about the son, it's about the father. The story of the prodigal father is a story, it's told in 5 scenes. Scene 1 is at the family homestead. It's about the father dividing his property between his 2 sons. Scene 2 covers what happens to the younger son, who runs to faraway lands and squanders his wealth in reckless living. Scene 3 describes the interaction between the father and the younger son when the younger son finally returns. And scene 4 picks up with the older son out in the field. And scene 5 is about how the older son returns. Or does he? I mean, to understand that, I think we need to understand a whole bunch of rich first century Jewish culture. How does that sound this morning? Does that sound interesting? So let's just walk through this parable scene by scene. Let's shrug off for a moment everything we think we might know about the first century Jewish culture. And then we'll just try to fill in and allow the Spirit to color this beautiful picture for all of us. Can we do that scene by scene in our time? Are you ready? So here we go. In scene 1, the younger son asks the father to divide his property between his sons so that the younger son can have his inheritance now. And amazingly, the father does. I mean, at first glance, you might think it was just this really cool dad, right? Or a dad without many boundaries. No, that's not me. McKenna would say otherwise. But a dad who's just too tightly wrapped around his children's fingers. You might be right on both counts, but I think you'd be missing the point, really, of what's going on in this scene, because what Jesus was actually describing in the beginning of this story here would be scandalous to every person who heard it, rich, poor, young, old, shepherd, rabbi, Pharisee. No one in the Middle East would ever think to make such a request of their father, because to ask for your inheritance early would really be tantamount to expressing a death wish on the father. An author, Ken Bailey, who lived in that region of the world for quite some time, actually wrote about this. He went around interviewing these cultures about this question. And he says, for over 15 years, I've been asking people of all walks of life, from Morocco to India, from Turkey to Sudan, about the implications of a son's request for his inheritance while the father is still living. The answer has almost always been emphatically the same. And he writes this dialogue of the conversation runs as follows. He asks, has anyone ever made such a request in your village? Never. Could anyone ever make such a request? Impossible. Well, if anyone did, what would happen? His father would beat him, of course. Why? Well, this request means he wants his father to die. One Middle Eastern writer, Ibrahim Sayyid, writes, the shepherd in his search for the sheep, the woman in her search for the coin, they don't do anything out of the ordinary beyond what anyone in their place would do. But the actions the father takes in the third story are unique, marvelous, divine actions which have not been done by any father in the past. Divide your inheritance so that I can have my share of the estate. That's the request. Essentially, what this younger son is saying. Father, you are useless to me. I really wish you'd just die, but since you're not going to die, can we pretend you're dead? I need my inheritance now. And to everyone's amazement, the father does. The next words of the story go like this. Not long after that, the younger son got together all that he had, set off for a distant country, and there squandered his wealth on wild living. Most Westerners, I even thought that the son takes off instantly. He goes quickly because he was just a party animal, plain and simple, and being in the same town with his conservative old dad just cramped his style, but that's not his motivation for leaving, I don't think. Notice that he didn't leave immediately. He left not long after that. Why? Well, he had to liquidate his inheritance. He had to get the cash, right, to go spend and squander. He had to find a buyer for his portion of the family farm, his portion of the family jewels, perhaps, or his portion of the livestock. And the only people he could sell to were the people in the village. So as Jesus is telling this story, I imagine his listeners were imagining this brash young man who needs a good beating, going from door to door, trying to convince people who knew his father, knew he had done something reckless, and now this brash young son is trying to sell this wealthy man's estate. He's established in the community, and this son is just, how can he make a request like this? How could he even think to come to us that we would buy off his father's estate? All those folks knew that this kid had just insulted his father, his family, shamed him in their minds, and probably wished him dead. And now he's doing this unthinkable thing, selling off property and possessions that had been in the family for generations upon generations. One commentator states at every turn, he's greeted with amazement and horror and rejection. This family's estate is a significant part of Middle Eastern identity and culture and heritage, the community identity. And as this scorn mounts, this son feels more and more pressure to get out of town. Wouldn't you? So his son, he leaves soon after he's sold off the last of his goods and got the cash he needs, and by now the villagers are probably openly antagonistic towards him, probably threatening of stoning. And there's been talk about shunning and publicly shaming him, even stoning and taking some action to put this young upstart, this insolent, reckless fool in his place, if he gets to live. So as soon as all the negotiations are done and the transactions completed, the son just skips town, leaves, heads for faraway lands, which is where scene 2 takes place. In the faraway country, this wayward son gradually descends into his own personal hell. The text says he squandered his wealth in wild living. He wasted it. And you know what's interesting is all the citizens of this faraway country would learn his story because information traveled slower than now, but quicker than we think. They would quickly learn who this young person is coming into their community living recklessly. They too are unimpressed with this frivolous young man who is now out of money. The polite way a Middle Easterner gets rid of an unwanted hangers-on, moochers we might call them today, isn't to come right out and tell them to go home. It's to assign them a task that they'll refuse and then be offended and then choose to leave. So when the son asks for a job, one of the citizens offers to let him become a pig herder. It's a job no self-respecting Jewish boy could accept. It was against their laws. Pigs were unclean animals according to the law of Moses. And they had to be fed every day of the week, 7 days of the week, which meant he couldn't keep the Sabbath. So to everyone's surprise, he accepts the job. But it's a terrible job. It doesn't pay well enough to stave off the hunger. He actually gets, it's hinted at in the story that he's kind of longing for what the pigs are eating because he's so hungry. So in this hole of self-pity, he begins to think honestly about himself. He knows there is no life for him in this foreign land. Yet, I'm sure the emotion of what he did to his father, physically, emotionally, spiritually, is bubbling up in his face because he, the son, wished him dead and is now a failure. He squandered everything. Worse, he offended his family. And now he has absolutely nothing left to offer his father. Middle Eastern sons are supposed to provide for their fathers in their old age and not live off of them. So he begins to think creatively. And he realizes he can't go back home and ask to live in the family house as a son. He ruined that. But maybe he could go home and ask for a job as a hired servant. And maybe, just maybe, if he works hard enough and saves as much as he can, someday, maybe there is a small chance he will be able to earn enough to be of some use to his father. So he comes up with a plan. He'll go home. He'll admit he was a fool. And instead of asking to be reinstated as a son, he'll ask to be hired as a servant. Anything is better than where he is now. Right? And the plan has merit in his mind, except for one thing. Even if the father accepts his terms, he's got to face the scorn and the wrath of the villagers. So all of you who have moved here from a foreign country or a foreign state even, it's difficult to return home unless there's some kind of success story, right? I experienced this. New England seems to be a magnifying glass in this regard. I'm just going to come out and say it. I consider myself a New Englander. I mean, I grew up in Eastern Mass, north of Boston, on the North Shore. But as soon as I got back here, I was promptly corrected after moving here, after spending 7 years in Maryland. You are not a New Englander. I was quickly corrected. Maybe you were once, but you left. Maybe your children's children can call themselves New Englanders. We'll see. Wow. Tough crowd. So this son has not only failed, he's a miserable disaster. But here's another problem. How did the villagers feel about him when he left? Well, I think we can surmise that they hated him. He had disgraced them all by wishing that his father was dead. And then again, disposing of the family's property. Adding to this, he lost all his money to despised Gentiles. And the prodigal son has no solution for what he's going to do with the villagers when he gets home. But I'm sure he must have been terrified that it's going to be in his face every day. He will simply have to endure communal disgrace, mocking, scorn, shame. And they will give that to him as he walks through the town on the way to his father's house. So in scene 3, the younger son returns. This is where the father comes into the story full force. The father, because of his experience, he knows 2 things. First, he knows that the son, given the maturity level and the character with which he left home, is bound to fail. That could be predicted. He knew that if his son ever does come home, if he ever comes home, it will probably not be as a successful businessman, more likely as a beggar. The second thing the father knows is that the village will not treat him well. That's a fact. Since his departure, all the townspeople have told him openly, probably repeatedly, that he should not have granted that inheritance in the first place, that this son was a scoundrel and deserves nothing short of death. He knows that if the son ever does return, the first person who sees him will likely pass the word that this rogue has actually come home. And a crowd will gather and likely begin to mock him and spit on him, if not hurt him outright. The father knows that the son, in order to get home, will have to endure the scorn of the crowd with every step he takes through the village. The father knows this. And what he does in scene 3 to counteract all this is nothing short of reckless and amazing. In scene 3, the Father does 5 things. Each one would be considered outrageous, scandalous in Middle Eastern society, but the Father strategically does each and every one of them in order to protect and restore his Son, whom he desperately loves. The Son who has turned away from him, rejected him, wished him dead. The first thing the Father does is he runs. When word comes to him that his Son has been seen on the outskirts of the village, the Father immediately runs to him. Can you see why this is so significant? Instead of letting his Son run the gauntlet, walk that hard mile, the Father literally picks up the gauntlet and runs it for him. It's an outrageous thing he does. Because a nobleman with flowing robes never runs anywhere for anything. He lifts his robes, exposing his undergarments and his ankles, and runs down the road through the village in front of all the villagers. He humiliates himself. One ancient Jewish person writes about running. He says, a man's manner of walking tells you what he is. Walking tells you what he is. A modern scholar writes, it's so very undignified in Eastern eyes for an elderly man to run. Aristotle, the famous Greek philosopher, said, great men never run in public. But this is what the Father does. Jesus explains why. He says, but while he was still a long way off, the Father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. He was filled with compassion for him. That's how the Father feels about his children. Instant compassion. No matter what anyone else thinks, he has compassion on us. Do you feel that? The Father deliberately runs through the village. He knows he's creating a spectacle. He knows that what he's doing will attract a crowd. He knows that they, the village, will talk about this humiliation now in the community for the rest of his life. And imagine this just for a moment from the Son's perspective. He knows his Father's authority and position in the community. He knows his family lives in town and that this town hates him, the Son. And he knows that there's no way he can get to his Father without enduring the scorn of the village, but he has to get to his Father in order to hopefully become a servant. So he takes a deep breath and he walks the last few miles towards the town, terrified, I'm sure. And the first sighting on the outskirts of the village, word starts spreading. People are gathering. His new life of disgrace and mockery and humiliation now begins. And as he comes and approaches the edge of the village, he expects to see rocks thrown, hurled at him, jeering, angry faces. And what does he see? Instead, he sees coming towards him the ankles and undergarments of his Father. To his utter amazement, rather than experiencing the ruthless hostility he deserves for what he's done, he finds visible demonstration of the love of a Father. Words can't express what this scene conveys, my friends. You can only imagine it in your mind. The Father runs. The second thing the Father does is he kisses the Son. The text says he ran to his Son, threw his arms around him, and kissed him. Can you picture it? They're embracing eye to eye, shoulder to shoulder. In his mind, the Son had pictured coming home and subjugating himself, dropping to his knees. First, he'd kiss his Father's hand, then he'd kiss his Father's feet. And third, he'd pray to God for any slim chance of the Father hiring him. But the Father won't let him picture this. Doesn't give him room to imagine that. He just immediately puts his arms around him and pulls him in and kisses him on both cheeks. This son can't bend. He can't stoop because the Father's holding him. All he can do is accept the love. Maybe that's what some of us need to do, is let go and accept the love. The Greek word used here to describe what the Father does is kataphileo. And in the Greek, literally, it means to kiss again and again and again and again. Constant. So picture yourself in this scene, my friend. You have wronged God and you know it. I've felt that many times. You know you're going to need to grovel, to confess, to admit wrongful action. Sometimes that can be the most terrifying thing, right? Make all sorts of promises and somehow try to mean it. But do you, is my question. Do I? Do I even approach God? I mean, if you're like me, you've got your speech planned, right? The little bullet points maybe on a note card. We all know what we've done, but here's the reality, the truth right now. If you don't get anything else from today's message, I pray that you all get this, every single one of you. God doesn't even let us begin with our groveling and our lists. The very second you even think about approaching him, he's embracing you. He's embracing you. Do you feel that? Do you believe it? Feel his arms around you in crumpled heavenly garments from his running to you. It's a powerful picture, isn't it? Now let's just back up for a moment and let's see what the son had planned to do when he first saw his father after getting through the village. Back in scene 2, he planned his whole speech. He says, I will set out and go back to my father and say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven. Interesting. I've sinned against heaven and you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired men. That's Luke 15, verse 19. That's his plan. That's his hope. That's all he's holding on to. He admits his guilt and asks to become a servant in his father's household. Now let's look at the actual speech when it comes in scene 3. Luke 15:21, the son said to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. What's missing from his speech? His request to become a servant. Why is it missing? Because he's overwhelmed, consumed, really, by the Father's love. His plan was to earn his way back into his Father's favor over years and years of humble service. He never intended to ask his Father to accept him back. Just as he was, how could he even think that? That was scandalous. But when the Father runs and kisses him, how could he not accept the Father's love for his son? The third thing the Father does is call for a robe to be put on his son. And just imagine this. Here are his exact words. But the Father said to the servants, Quick, bring the best robe and put it on him. And the question, who owned the best robe in the family, if he still had a robe? The Father. The father and son are standing on the edge of the village, and the father wants the whole village to know that he's accepted his son. So he sends the servants to get his own best robe so the son can wear it as he walks home through the village. It's amazing. The fourth thing the father does is call for a ring. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. The ring is probably a signet ring. It's the ring the father would use to stamp and sign all the documents, the family crest, which means the ring now on his son's finger, his son is a trusted, empowered, authoritative member of the family. The sandals are a sign that he's a free man. He's not a servant. Servants didn't get shoes. They went around barefoot unless they had the money to purchase sandals. Finally, the father says, bring the fatted calf and kill it. Not the fatted goat or a couple sheep or the fatted chicken. The fatted calf. Why a calf? Remember at the beginning of the series, we looked at a simple formula of protein served according to number of guests. Beef was only served if a lot of people were confirmed to attend your party. But the fatted calf was the choicest, best meat available. I mean, it had enough to feed a whole village. Do you see what the Father's doing? He's inviting the whole village to share his joy. He doesn't want the son to be reconciled only to him. This is interesting. He wants the son to be reconciled to the whole village, the community. He wants everyone to have restored relationship with his son who's come home. Wow. This is a story that no one could have anticipated. One commentator writes, for Palestinian listeners, initially the father would naturally be a symbol of God. Then as the story progresses, how could it be about God? Because the father comes down out of the house and in a dramatic act demonstrates unexpected love publicly in humiliation. It's a rags to unbelievable restored riches story. Only the riches aren't about money. It's about so much more. The riches are about measuring your worth, feeling your worth in God's eyes with his arms around you. And friends, it's priceless. You are priceless. Do you know this? Do you believe this? You are priceless, every single one of you. Do you see what Jesus is doing with this story? He's communicating to every person who ever wanted to take a step towards God just how significant we are to God. Jesus is telling us how God feels about us. He doesn't just wait for us to come home. He runs to us. He doesn't let us bear the shame of living our lives as if he was dead. He bears that for us. He dies for us and then kisses us and pulls us into a hug. He robes us. He clothes us. He gives us authority with the ring on our fingers, sandals on our feet. We are free in his arms. And then he kills the fatted calf to celebrate us with us and the angels. He invites everyone to celebrate us with him. I wish there was time to further unpack all the fascinating stuff about the way the father treats the older brother. We're going to briefly look at that. But just here's a couple things. In scene 4, we're now focused on the older son. What's he doing now? The older son hasn't left home. But if you read the story carefully, you'll discover that he too has left the father. After the scene opens, where is the older son? Well, he's working in the field. There are 2 mentions of the older son in the opening of the story. As Jesus begins the story, there was a man who had 2 sons. We read on. The younger son said to his father, "Father, give me my share of the estate." Right? And then we read, so he divided his property between them. Between them. In the first sentence, the older son is mentioned as one of the 2 sons, and in the second, he's mentioned as having received his share of the estate. He divided the property between them, so the older son now owns everything that he and his father now live on. It belongs to him, the older son. As the older son is coming in from the fields, he hears music after the younger son returns, right? And he gets the report from one of the servants that his brother has returned home, and that there's now a celebration. What's the older brother's response to this? Anger. He refuses to join the party. This would have been a severe insult to the father. humiliating him a second time in front of the whole village. Because the older son's role at the party was to welcome the guests, receive the guests, because he owns everything now that he and his father are living on. He should be greeting and welcoming everybody, but he doesn't. With him not at the party, the village now knows he also has rejected the father. And as you read on, you soon discover that in this older son's heart, he too has distanced himself as much from his father, I believe, as the younger son. He finally says to his father, "Look, all these years I've been slaving for you and never disobeyed your orders, yet you never gave me even a young goat so I could celebrate with my friends." Those two statements tip us off to the older son's distance from the father. First of all, does he think of himself as a son even? Doesn't seem like it, does it? No, he's slaving for the father. He hasn't lived with him like a son, but like a servant. What the younger son was hoping to do. The very thing the younger son had decided was the best chance in this life. The older son has that, and he's shaming his father. Secondly, this older son is upset because the father had never given him an animal to throw a party with his friends. Notice that in his mind, his friends do not include his father or his family. His friends do not include family. He's developed and built his own relational walls and barriers, and the father has nothing to do with it. The truly sad and amazing thing about the older son, though, is that he felt deprived by his father, because the father had never given him anything in his mind. No calf, no chicken, not even a goat. But what happened when the younger son left? The older son got his inheritance too. So the father comes out of the party. That is reckless. That is insulting to the community. Comes out of the party and says to the older son, "My son, you are always with me. Everything I have is yours." Literally. I already gave it to you, he's saying. All these years, it's been yours for the taking. You've had it. You just had to ask. The older son has distanced himself, and he refuses to join his father and his brother at the party. So what does the father do? The same thing he did for his younger son. He humiliates himself by leaving the party and going out to his older son. Here's what gets interesting. We're wrapping up, I promise. Are you ready? Jesus, like all good Jewish storytellers of his day, he tells this story, maybe some of us have heard this term, in a chiastic way. Do we know have we heard that? Just bear with me for 1 second, I'll explain it. All the stories from this region, from Middle Eastern culture, ancient Middle Eastern culture, almost all stories from the Bible are told within a certain structure called a chiasm. Chi is the Greek letter that looks like an X. If you read most Bible stories carefully, you'll find that you could diagram them to look like this. This is the story of the younger son, the prodigal son. A son is lost, goods spent in wild living, and so on. You'll see at one point there's a crux, there's a cross, another interesting phrase. And then we get to E prime, D prime, you see the form of it, it's symmetry. It looks like it's the front half of a chi, of an X. It's called a chiasm. Pretty cool, right? I mean, if you want to have some fun this afternoon, just look at other stories in the Bible and you'll probably find a similar pattern. So here's now what the older son's story looks like. Son is far off, your brother's safe, a feast, and so on. Not as many elements to the older son's story, but still structured in a similar way. What's missing? The conclusion. A prime. I want to suggest to you that Jesus is doing something very deliberate with this older son's story. It would have been intuitively understood by all the listeners, because all of them would have used this structure in their stories. That's how sort of the history was communicated orally, verbally, in memorable structures so that the children could repeat it. The only kind of stories they had ever heard were stories with this type of chiastic structure. For us, it would almost be like when we hear the notes of a scale, right? Do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti. Do, yeah. But Jesus leaves that off. It's interesting, isn't it? That's what you expect is resolution. There's a lack of resolve to the older son's story because in their minds there's a piece missing, the do, the high do. What did the older son do? So in the first story, a son is far off, but in the end he's found, and there's a celebration. In the second story, a son is far off, but in the end, what does he do? That's the question that we're left with this parable. That's what he left with the Pharisees and everyone else listening to this story with the lost sheep, the lost coin, the lost son. God is holding up that spiritual mirror we keep talking about. Clearly, in their minds, what Jesus is saying is, we are the older son. We are the older sons. What are we going to do? What are we going to do? We are the ones who had strayed and tried to obey and serve God. Maybe we feel like we're slaves. I've felt like that. I still feel like that every now and then. But in their hearts, Jesus is saying, you are far off. You got it wrong. You don't want to come to the party, do you? You don't want to celebrate the return of a wayward son. You judge it. A son who squandered their living in foreign lands, doing things we couldn't possibly comprehend. You don't want to be near the Father, do you? Is what Jesus is saying. Jesus is saying that the younger son understands and accepts that he is far off, and then actually rejoices with his father now that he's been found. He admits he was lost, and the father runs to him and outrageously welcomes him back into the home. And the older son is far off too, and he's mad at the father. So he refuses to come in. He refuses to join the celebration. The father comes out to meet him in just as much humiliation and recklessness as he ran to the younger son. He talks about rejoicing and asks the son, please, come in, please. But does the son come in? That's what we're left with. Will you come in? God is asking me, Pastor Tripp, will you come in? You see, the point of the story is that the Father loves all his children. All of them. Amen. He's willing to suffer and be humiliated in order to personally bring each and every one of us home. Will you come home? Will you let him love you? Will you choose close relationship with him? Will you acknowledge how much he loves you? And will you respond to his love? I'd just like to end this time with a popular Christian artist. Her name's Britt, Nicole. I don't really respond to her music, but then this song has been on the radio, and I found an acoustic version of it. Every now and then, from someone you don't even expect or resonate with, can come a message from God, right? God is good all the time. She wrote a song that precisely captures everything we've been talking about, everything we're trying to affirm in ourselves, our worth in God's eyes. That's far more valuable than anything the world has to offer. Do you know that? Do you believe that? I mean, really listen to these lyrics. They're going to be projected. And let's end with this and make this our prayer. God bless all of you.
Get it together, that's what I say to me. Put on the pressure, you could do better, be who you're supposed to be. But that's when you came in, right when I needed you. You said all of the things that I was believing, not one of them were true. You lifted my head up, I was keeping my head down. I didn't know love, but I do now. 'Cause you stood around not anymore, not since you rescued me. You lifted my head up, was keeping my head